So good evening, guys. Tonight is 11 p.m. of October 18th, 2019. So I didn't do what I said last video where recorded I wanted to record back to back. I couldn't. I fell asleep. I guess it took um, checking off one video was enough. I thought I was restless last night. Turns out I just needed to tick one thing off the checklist of things that were going on in my unquiet mind to be able to calm my state to fall asleep. So, anyway, now this is part two of our read through of Poetry for Pleasure. And let's go towards the second portion, where yesterday we read the acknowledgments and the intro by Joyce C. Hall, Tastes and Times, recounting how, in the history of Hallmark, their eagerness for this endeavor to compile this list of poems. Now we're going to read an essay by Webster Schott, entitled "Poetry, Yes." So I think this is skimming through it before. What was interesting is it had some snippets of poems, and I think it's trying to um, be more of an intro to the book of how to absorb these poems, how to read them, and try to, you know, go about this poetic journey. So let's begin. Poetry, yes. On a brilliant May morning, a 4-year-old girl with fresh blue eyes and corn silk hair ran up to our breakfast table, talking to herself and to any listening thing nearby. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. The child laughed, climbed up on the bench, and ordered her bowl of shredded wheat. And I was left to think of what her recitation had meant. Nothing? No. Everything. For she had said how to begin with poetry. Surely, her play with words belonged somewhere in the history of poetry. For though it's several thousand years, poetry has always been said or sung, beginning with ancient chants and incantations, then taking the form of primitive songs, becoming oriental odes, changing into the early elegiac Greek couplets and heady Roman lyrics, growing into Dark Age ballads, and finally evolving into the charged language we call poetry in comparatively modern times. Change has had its way with poetry, but the elementary condition of poetry has never changed. Poetry may be read silently, but it cannot be felt that way. For this, it must be said aloud, as it was from its start. So, taking a step back, it's really, like I said in the previous video about how these I wanted to celebrate and give acknowledgement by reading the acknowledgements of these people who may be long gone, who have worked so hard to create this book, which I may have never encountered. And now we're trying to take an even further step back and celebrate humanity, you know? Like, all of us here on this earth, like 7 billion people, we all share this thing, this language. We don't share a language, but we share language. We share culture. We share communication, ergo, we share community. And I think that's what separated us from, how we took a step above and became who we are today. It wasn't just developing like sentience, it wasn't just developing faster brain synapses and a better understanding of science and technology. I think it was John Green who I heard where the most important thing or the best thing that humanity has going for it is community. And I think poetry, this art form, really, as said in the essay, has accompanied us since the very beginning. And I think it's a beautiful celebration of that. So keep that in mind. The other side of my May reverie was that the whole episode occurred spontaneously. For the sheer joy of the words bursting forth from a little girl whose spirit matched the morning. She was in love with the sound of the words, the way she marched and danced together, the silly delight of the rhymes, the bounce of the rhythm. She may or may not have known what fetch and crown meant. I will have to ask her sometime. Nor did she care about why these words were put in this particular order, or whether it was tragedy or comedy she described. Both, of course, are in the poem, as she galloped into the kitchen. The reason for recalling this is not to say that we should be childlike in approaching poetry, but to insist that poetry's first pleasure is the same pleasure the child finds, the picture magic of sound discovered in music, an art which is closer kin to poetry than prose is. So, I guess this goes back to that beautiful passage about how change has had its way with poetry, but the elementary nature of poetry has never changed. Again, it's been with humanity since the beginning. Even though there are many changes, the rules from sonnets to free-flowing spoken word, there's this sort of like unspoken thing where you know what the poem is. And it's not this childlike in approach, but poetry's first pleasure is the same pleasure that a child finds. So it's not that we're gonna take these poems very basic, but I guess it helps that this is a very new endeavor for me. Perhaps I've never encountered many of these poems before, so we'll be discovering them and have that childlike picture magic of sound discovered in music. Listen to the ring of these lines, light in meaning but full of music, from Poe's The Bells. Hear the sledges with the bells, silver bells. What a world of merriment their melody foretells. How they tinkle, tinkle, tinkle in the icy air of night, while the stars that oversprinkle all the heavens seem to twinkle with a crystalline delight, keeping time, 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 in a sort of runic rhyme. Or, read aloud the first stanza from D. H. Lawrence's The Sea. Certainly this poem is something more than an array of words, but Lawrence's root idea is an ordinary one. The sea is cruel and lonely. The rolling, swelling patterns of sound move the poem away from the cliché behind it. Meaning is less relevant than sonorous beauty. You are all in loving, loveless, you. Restless and lonely, shaken by your own moods. You are celibate and single, scorning a comrade even, threshing your own passions with no woman for the threshing floor, finishing your dreams for your own sake only, playing your great game around the world alone, without playmate or helpmate, having no one to cherish, no one to comfort, and refusing any comforter. This is the sea in sound, and when you examine the poem more closely, also the sea in impersonal reality. It may be interesting to search the first lines of Gerard Manley Hopkins's poem Spring and Fall. Margaret, are you grieving over Golden Grove unleaving? Leaves, like the things of man, you, with your fresh thoughts care for, can you? And practice amateur psychoanalysis on a child who weeps over the facts of botany, or to settle for yourself whether Paul Engel's daughter was crying, white with anger and filled with cold-blooded hatred, in his poem You Can't Be Wise. Denied, she screamed in rage and ran away. I yelled. She halted, rigid in her going, water frozen in the act of flowing. Hopkins's little girl honors life while mourning the inevitability of death, displaying a highly precocious and disturbing emotionalism. In Engel's poem, the figure of speech using water implies tears, the words frozen and rigid, cold hatred. But if all of these inferences are valid, and you make them, they have little effect on your first pleasure of hearing Hopkins's melodious lament or the suffering, stabbing quickness of Engel's lines. The first delight of poetry comes spontaneously with the words, for the poem's meaning is forever wedded to its utterance. The form itself expresses the truth of the poem. This is what Archibald MacLeish was talking about when he wrote, "A poem should not mean, but be." The early meaning of a poem is in the form, its pattern of sound, and our emotional response to this sound. So that was quite a journey. I didn't know if I should have stopped after each poem, but then I felt like I should have go straight towards completion on all these. Now, wow. Again, I think I just sort of like took a back seat. I wasn't actively trying to digest these poems as I went along, because I was still in the mindset of the first poem with Edgar Allan Poe's The Bells, and I while I was reading it, I was remembering like a contest in high school where they had these classes perform this in like a jazz setting, like they had choreography and stuff like, but yeah, like coming from that of the tinkle tinkle tinkle, those playful repetitions, to the sea which is very, if you recall earlier, these things of from the melodic poem of Poe's The Bells to the H. Lawrence's The Sea, which is more. It felt very like, I don't know if like it's a cliche, but it really felt like he was describing the sea as this like really like this scorned lover, you know, like you are all unloving, loveless, you restless and lonely. So yeah, I don't know. It was my first time reading that. I don't know if I should say these with like an accent with very much emotion, you know, because again, this in in all honesty, this is my second try in making this video, because like a few minutes into the first recording, there was this loud sound, and I wanted to repeat that. And my first reading of the Jack and Jill poem didn't have the sing-songiness performance of what we all know its tune. And now, I guess moving on with this series, maybe we'll do like a first read through, and then dissect it, and then a second read through with feelings. I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, moving to the thought of this essay. Yeah, it goes into like this deep analysis of this poem, but I think he wanted to not dissuade, but more really focus on the form itself in its first utterance, which is what we're trying to do. A poem should not mean, but be. Like, early poems were just stories, and stories didn't have all this intent back then, you know? They had lessons, but a poem should not mean, but be. The early meaning of a poem is in its form, its pattern of sound, and our emotional response to the sound. So I guess first reading, how we feel, how it makes us feel, and then we'll do the dissection, and then second reading. I should write all of this down. I'll keep it in mind. Let's move on to the next portion of the essay. Music and meaning. The parallel between poetry and music is obvious, but we don't demand that the harmonies or rhythms of music mean anything beyond themselves. Although such matters do carry significance for specialists in the field. We don't ask what Enesco's Romanian rhapsodies are about. They may be occult or even subversive for all we know or care. How we respond to Bach's precisely iridescent Brandenburg concertos has nothing to do with what we think the music and the composer may be trying to say to us. We don't ask what music means, because music isn't the way we communicate with one another day after day. We know that music is harmonic poetry, that it speaks to us in an extraordinary way, that it will not withstand the bloodless analysis of science. It is, we say, art. So, again, it stresses how, music, like, there is an inherent musical quality to poetry, And yeah, it goes back to intent, you know, like put aside the lyrics. If we go to melody and like in classical music, we don't we don't we sh- we don't put put into perspective the intent, you know, like when I first heard For Elise, I in my sister's jewelry music box. I didn't even know its name. I didn't know. I'm pretty sure it was Mozart or Beethoven, one of those two. Anyway, I didn't know about that story, how he wrote it for someone, but it was this beautiful melody that I wanted to keep the music box on, drain its battery, and keep listening to the electronic. It's floaty, dreamlike quality. So, again, that's how we should approach poetry. But with language, we are in another habit. Words stand for things. We expect words to mean something, and always say, we expect words to mean something, and always the same somethings. This is where we get into trouble with poetry. The poet doesn't use the words the way the rest of us do. He chooses his words and phrases for their sounds and rhythms. And poets' notebooks and revised drafts reveal how often they collect verbal images or alter their lines for these effects alone. The poet takes old words and arranges them together in new ways. They still possess all of their old meanings, but they acquire new meanings because of their nearness to one another, or because the poet discovers new meanings for them in life. New emotions are wrung from old language. The poet invents new figures of speech. His expressions and impressions are superimposed. His subconscious and conscious sensibilities are dredged and disciplined until through an act of language he has defied all the limits of language and has created joy or anguish or emptiness which is greater than reality. Wow. Like it said before in this essay how like poetry expresses like music even better like than prose, but that prose was very poetic, you know. Like I like the rhythm of what I just read. It was beautiful. This is what happens in poetry. The poet attempts to give voice to the inexpressible. His command of language has always been that it struggle to exceed itself. When Edgar Allan Poe writes that, "Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping of someone gently rapping at my chamber door." It is not only a bird that Poe's narrator hears summoning him. It is the inevitable course of man, the end of life, total darkness. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting, on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. Death waits. death takes all. The raven is both a bird and more than a bird. It is the end of hope, the unknowable blackness. The Raven is not a poem one clips and carries in his billfold, but we respond to it because we go with Poe as his mind reaches beyond his words. So, taking in all of that, where, yeah, like words are funny, you know, when I used to consider myself, when I was still very active in writing, um, I wanted to call myself like a weaver of words, and it was a beautiful arrangement of how these threads overlap and intersect and form this beautiful image that I weaved. And yeah, something beyond what the literal meaning of words. Poetry tries to say beyond what it's saying. If you can suppress your imagination when you read 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird by Wallace Stevens, you draw only a blank. The poem seems abstract to the point of mystery. Although blackbirds turn up in every stanza, but give Stevens your head, and you will discover that every time he used the word blackbird, he has something else in mind. The persistence of life, the search of conscience, man standing on the needlepoint of nature. And very likely he continuously enjoyed the whimsy of placing blackbird and its implications in such extraordinary surroundings. Here are the first 8 stanzas of this remarkable poem, which flies away with the imagination. They speak of a reality beyond the borders of language. Among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of the blackbird. I was of 3 minds, like a tree, in which there are 3 blackbirds. The blackbird whirled in autumn winds. It was a small part of the pantomime. A man and a woman are one. A man and a woman and a blackbird are one. I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling or just after. Icicles filled the long window with barbaric glass. The shadow of the blackbird crossed it to and fro. The mood traced in the shadow an indecipherable cause. O thin men of Haddam, why do you imagine golden birds? Do you not see how the blackbird walks around the feet of the woman about you? I know noble accents and lucid, inescapable rhythms. But I know, too, that the blackbird is involved in what I know. Okay. So the blackbird. So we should have used our imagination in that. But I guess I was too preoccupied with the structure. I don't see how the blackbird... Well, that's just me. I may need to reread it But that's not what we're doing today. We're blowing through this essay together. So the third section, poetry and icebergs. The way to read a poem is with an open mind, not an open dictionary. A good poem doesn't need a dictionary. The poem itself provides the meaning for the words the poet puts to work. It seems too simple to be true, yet there is no other way. You discover meaning by reading the poem, but more than once and aloud. And if that won't do the trick, read another poem. Art is undemocratic. Not all poems are written for all readers. Reading poetry must be a pleasure, not a social responsibility. Poetry is supposed to be beautiful, not an intellectual obligation. The first beauty lies in its language, where poetry and everyone who reads it must begin. But language is only the means by which poetry fulfills its promise. A poem is like an iceberg. We see the peak and project the depth. The union between the poem and the reader as he follows the lines down below the surface into the poem's profusion of possible meanings is the great recurrent pleasure of reading poetry. The poet fuses all of his experience with all of our experience, and each time we read a poem, we find something new about the poem, ourselves, and the rest of life. So, I guess it really, you know, like language, as like I did say earlier, you know, we don't share one language, but language is the platform, the channel wherein poetry gets its magic. It's an iceberg. We see the peak and project the depth. What we discover in the poem is as much read into as written into the poem. But the greatest poets, Shakespeare, Whitman, Yeats, and whomever one turns to again and again, fill their poems with possibilities for meaning and emotional response. Their poetry, as all lasting poetry, operates on several levels of experience at once. Whitman's Cavalry Crossing a Ford steals the ear with its rhythms. A line in long array, or scarlet and blue and snowy white, the guidon flags flutter gaily in the wind. The language is alive and spoken. No poetic sweet talk, no mythology. Simultaneously in the mind's eye flashes the picture of the column crossing the stream and stopping to drink. Read with greater care, the poem becomes like an impressionistic painting, a study in swift movement and subtle shading. From the first line to last, the poem moves with a cavalry troop. The action of the poem is wedded to the subject of the poem. With more thought, Cavalry Crossing a Ford begins to seem peculiarly American in its unconscious contrast of the exhausted men and the brazen pennants of the Civil War. It is a gentle song to the bond Whitman felt with everything American, including contradictions. And read in the 1960s, Cavalry Crossing a Ford is also a hymn to the last romantic war in history. Such is hindsight, but everything we know goes into our reading of the poem. The best poem seizes your mind the first time you read it. There's an immediate impact. You feel the poem, even though you cannot describe the feeling precisely or quickly. By the second or third reading, the poem becomes part of you. You own it. You possess it in ways that only you can, for you have set the poem's limits. This is what H. M. Tomlinson must have meant when he said that the reader who is illuminated is in a real sense the poem. Poetry says what the same words, or different words, arranged in any other order cannot say. This is why analyzing or paraphrasing a poem can never substitute for the experience of personally discovering the poem. You can say what a little girl's smile is like, or you can describe the scatter of stars on a black night. But will you settle for words when you can have that smile? And can an astronomer's lecture take the place of your wandering wonder when you are lost in the stars? The poem itself is the miracle of feeling and intelligence, and it is possible to make a good argument that any poem which can survive being taken apart and laid out like a gearbox is no poem at all. The successful poem puts us into a new relationship with life, a relationship which never existed before. Poetry is a way of seeing things, and as a result, feeling these relationships which never existed before. It is not rhythm, rhyme, or figures of speech. These are only the means to poetry's ends. Poetry is the quality of awareness, emotion captured and surrendered. Love is patient, love is kind. Nah. Yeah, poetry. So, again, in summary, poetry is meant to be felt. Those were very beautiful images, you know. A girl's smile, being lost in the stars. Now, again, I'm questioning the process of this read through, you know. Like, my original plan was to read the poem, feel it, you know, load some, you know, some articles or like blogs, like lectures on what the poem meant. But then upon reading this, that's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to feel. And I know that, you know, me trying to do that would be like me trying to be, you know, trying to be like a teacher, you know. Oh, hey, we're discovering this together, but let's dive deep into the meaning of that. But I don't know. Maybe it's just, maybe this podcast is less about, you know, the intellectual pursuit, you know, as before. Like, poetry isn't supposed to be like a requirement. It's our own journeys. Like, a poem is not for everyone, and we all could take different messages and meanings from the same set of words that aren't even meaning what they literally mean. So, I don't know, we'll see when we begin. When we gaze upon our first poem. So, next part. Time's temper. A few pages earlier, I said change has had its way with poetry. I should have said change has had its way with men. For like the other arts, poetry does not grow in a laboratory dish, thriving in airy isolation. Poetry is intimately related to everything happening to people and their world. It is contemporaneous, expressing the special sensibilities of its age. The greatest poets, often unconsciously, record the psychological stresses and tensions of their and make us participants in them. Poetry reflects the new realities of man's condition, and as often as not, it has brought these new visions out of darkness and make them public. The process of catching up, the closing of the gap between what poet perceives and what the mass of his readers may not have yet to discover, has produced both poetry's great successes and great losses. Boris Pasternak once called poetry the expression of the birth pangs of the new in the world. Through history, these pangs have been accompanied by cries of misunderstanding. In the early 1600s, when John Donne and the new metaphysical poets following Shakespeare began writing, Ben Jonson complained that now nothing is good that is natural. The writhed and tortured is considered the more exquisite. Nothing is fashionable till it be deformed. Another critic said that the metaphysical imagery and sophisticated language of Donne, James Cowley, and Thomas Carew were ingenious nothings, mere embroideries upon cobwebs. 200 years later, a major critical journal of the day said Wordsworth's Ode on the Intimations of Immortality was illegible and unintelligible, and could give no analysis or explanation of it. When it first appeared, Coleridge's Christabel was called a rhapsody of delirium. Shelley's Prometheus Unbound was a tissue of insufferable buffoonery, and his Adonais was a mere collection of bloated words heaped on each other without order, harmony, or meaning. But we know now that Donne was the first poet to give voice to the new vision of the universe as seen by Kepler and Galileo. We know now that Wordsworth's contemporaries were hearing backwards, were deaf to poetry whose majesty lay in simplified diction. Now we know that Shelley had found a new lyrical relationship between man and his world. Like life, poetry continually renews and reorganizes itself. It is forever discovering. As Shelley said, the previously unapprehended relationships. As Shelley said, the previously unapprehended relations of things, and perpetuates their apprehension. Greek and Roman poetry trembled with such adjustments. Medieval lyrics rearranged Christian ideals and earthly urges to such an extent that a man could carry on his love affairs in church. Writers of the ancient, rigorous Chinese odes so successfully invested their poetry with the peculiar symbolism of their times that we still cannot say what the peach trees are for in their poems about wedding ceremonies. In our own time, the readjustment of poetry has been nothing less than a literary upheaval, with all the manifestos, rivalries, labels, slogans, and war cries of revolution. It has been misunderstood as any poetry in history, and its conceptions have been so far in advance, or behind, depending on your vantage point, of public sensibilities that our poetry has almost, but not quite, lost its audience. Now, that felt like a 180. um, like, so far, this essay was all about like poetry is beautiful. Um, we should celebrate its feeling, but then like all this idealistic imagery and such, and then it drops reality about how like like change has had its way with poetry. Change has how it had its way with humanity. How history has been written and rewritten. Like how things are lost to time. Like I remember my freshman year of college, my English lit class about like the etymology of the word fiction. It's rooted in like fingere and facere, about how fiction it's not lies, but it's more of an incomplete image of the whole truth. That's fiction. And throughout history, in hindsight, like artists aren't appreciated during their time. They're always appreciated after. Like these Wordsworth, John Donne, even going to art like um, Picasso and Jesus, appreciated after they're gone. Like looking back, like oh. So I guess this is also a point to how don't take it so seriously. You might never know the full picture, like you might be completely wrong. So that was Time's Temper. On to the next section. The spirit of the new. The poetry we call modern is already old. It began in the late 19th and early 20th century, born of radical changes in the way men lived throughout of themselves. Born of the radical changes in the way men lived and thought of themselves. It came as a reaction against growing materialism in Europe and America. It came as an expression of the poet's estrangement from public life. It came as a symptom of the great social and ideological complexities of industrialization. Under the new conditions of life in the early 20th century, the traditional rhetoric of poetry seemed dead and false. The traditional emotions seemed phony. The poetry of the past did not conform to the experience of the present. Science was replacing the arts as the chief interpreter of human behavior. And to place himself in the new era, the poet was compelled to find new ways of knowing about man. Aesthetic values were being displaced by commercial values, and the poet's reaction was to create art for its own sake. Against the disorderliness of the age, as Arthur Rimbaud said, the poet went about an intentional disordering of the senses. In the other arts, painting, music, and to a lesser degree sculpture, much of the same thing was happening. Old forms were fractured. Surprisingly, the first outlines of what is modern in poetry were drawn in the United States, where Edgar Allan Poe was practicing what he called a suggestive indefiniteness. In Poe, a group of young literary insurgents in France found their model, and French symbolism became the first full-scale modernist movement in poetry. Led by Charles Baudelaire, the symbolists created a new kind of poetry in which one poetic symbol or image implied a second, and in which one sensual impression was used to suggest still another. They dealt almost exclusively in these symbols, and the meaning, but not the music, of their poetry required lengthy symbolic analysis. The example of the symbolists spread almost immediately through the rest of the civilized world. From symbolism came Russian and Italian futurism, and lines designed to bring the modern style of speed and dynamism to poetry. From French symbolism came English and American imagism, and free verse filled with cadence, foreign language, and the imagined excitements of the poet. And from the symbolists came T.S. Eliot and scholarship as poetry, erudition as craftsmanship, and the ideal of a poetry so transparent that we cannot see the poetry in it. Poetry with nothing poetic about it, poetry standing naked in its bare bones. We should not see the poetry, but what the poem points at. A hard and stark age begot a hard and stark poetry. So we're now starting to go through like this rebranding, of how like we just came from like a history of how man has changed, and thus this constant changing the view of how we shouldn't be even interpreting poetry because it's definitely gonna be wrong. And then we move on to an age where man has been through leaps and bounds in science, industrialization, how life, the world has changed, and thus poetry should change, and it has. These men, well, yeah, I kind of see how it was the 60s, so the language is very male centric, but like these men, of course there were women back in the day, but yeah, this history was written by men, so that's unfortunate. But as we see through this a history lesson, how wow, Edgar Allan Poe was more of a pioneer than I thought. How it went and blossomed and went through other things and inspired other people, like how it's kind of exciting, living in those times, being where, things of great thought. What must it have felt like to be part of a society that's, I would say, like, budding so creatively. But even then, like, looking through the description, it also felt urgent, and it felt scary, and it must have been very uncertain times where, you know, the medium, the art itself, was forced practically to change over the course of a very short period. It had to have a very drastic change, very drastic movements of people around the world were expressing different points of view. So it was both exciting yet terrifying, I must say. I don't know. The social antagonism of the earliest modern poetry has run its course by now. But all poetry of the 20th century has fallen heir to the stylistic legacy of the symbolist revolution. Contemporary poetry is irregular in rhyme and rhythm. It operates without reference to a recognizable body of poetic technique. It follows no Baedeker's guide of approved mythology or poetic allusion. The stilted expressions, the great heroes, the passionate loves, the gingerbread rhetoric of the old poetry are gone. Modern poetry's language is common, even though its metaphors are not. Modern poetry's language, sorry. Modern poetry's language is common, even though its metaphors are not. The modern poet lays down no linguistic underbrush for the mind to cut through. Lines like T.S. Eliot's "When the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table," or Boris Pasternak's "The Caucasus lay spread before our gaze, an unmade bed, it seemed, with tousled sheets," seize the imagination because they assault us directly. Here is the life, vivid and filled with surprise. In their later years, W. H. Auden, Eliot, Pasternak, and others turned to theology for comfort. But these are the endings of these poets, not their beginnings. And religion in contemporary poetry is primarily an English language phenomenon. One finds little of it in modern Italian, German, or French poetry. The poet of our time most often finds his inspiration in conscience, the common man, the social interplay, the new cosmos of the new scientific era. When he deals with nature, the contemporary poet writes from nature, not about nature. Suggestiveness, the association of one idea with another, is inherent in art. But the contemporary poet magnifies the power of suggestion by leaping at random from one impression to the next. The relationships in contemporary poetry are arbitrary. They are decreed by the poet, not by the laws of logic or the reasonableness of cause and effect. Okay. So it feels like, I don't know why, maybe because it's a chapter later. I didn't look at the table of contents deeply, but yeah, it feels like, oh hey, there's this big disclaimer of a movement from, oh, poetry, excuse me, poetry must be felt. It's in its structure, and it's in its first reading. It's in the experience of saying it out loud. To from that to, oh, it's not about the meaning, because meanings, it means something else than what it's saying. To, oh, even if you try to decipher its meaning, you might be wrong in hindsight. To, oh, there was a time when everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. Because the Fire Nation symbolizes industrialization. No, let's go past that. That's not what this channel, that's not what this podcast is gonna do. Now, from that to that to that to, oh hey, now it's very basic. It's not from before, like Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven is about death, and The Blackbird is about the vividness of life, even though I didn't see that. To now, the Caucasus is a bed. The evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized on a table. These metaphors are very literal, concise, direct. So we're going on a journey, it seems, already. It's this video is now an hour long. I have been speaking, reading aloud for an hour straight. This is the most I've spoken this entire week since Monday, because I don't talk much to people, and here I am. I've read many pages of a dissection of poetry, so this is an experience, hence the coughing. But yeah, taking a step back, I feel like I'm more energetic tonight because I wasn't so dazed and out of my mind, because it's not yet 3 a.m. I hope I finish this essay before 3 a.m. Anyway, let's get back. Attention, please. Most 20th century poets. Attention, please. Most 20th century poetry does demand greater attention than much of the poetry preceding it, particularly the highly formalized lyrics of the Romantic periods of English literature. But the age we live in requires all of our wits, and effort is relative anyway. You must expend it whether you lift a brick or move a mountain. The question is always one of purpose. So, wow, I think that's different from what I just said earlier about how, well, I thought it was about contemporary poetry so basic, but now it's demands greater attention than much poetry preceding it. That's interesting. But I guess, yeah, it says it's all relative. You know, whether you lift a brick or move a mountain, they both require effort, varying degrees. I guess it's up to you whether you treat the poem as a brick or as a mountain. Poetry has never been easy reading. It has always demanded the best the mind can muster. Shakespeare's sonnets are not simple-minded jingles waiting to be set to soap. They are exceedingly complex poems, rich in the glories of language. Read his Sonnet 15 with the same degree of attention you give a subscription renewal letter and see what happens. Okay, so the book says I should read his sonnet with the same degree of attention that I should give a subscription renewal letter. So basically, just skim fast, just read, no emotion, just okay. Subscription is renewed. Okay. When I consider everything that grows, holds in perfection but a little moment, that this huge stage presented naught but shows, whereon the stars in secret influence comment, when I perceive that men as plants increase, cheered and checked even by the self-same sky, vaunt in their youthful sap as height decrease, and wear their brave state out of memory, then the conceit of this inconstant stay sets you most rich in youth before my sight, where wasteful time debateth with decay. To change your day of youth to sullied night, and all in war with time for love of you, as he takes from you, I engraft you new. Okay. So I tried to read that. Some of you may have caught that I was going to the lyrical for a moment in some lines, but yeah. It's beautiful to the ear, but it must be read 2 or 3 times to find the intelligence it transmits. Yeah, I thought this was like the other sonnets, the more popular ones. I had no idea. I wasn't familiar with this one, so I had no idea how it flowed. Then you discover that Shakespeare was saying to a mistress or a patron, as time wears you down, I build you up. You may be getting older, as we all must, but I renew your beauty by writing to you. So I'll try to read it with feelings now. So the first reading was like a subscription renewal letter, or maybe that was a mistake on my part. It may be the same attention you give a subscription renewal letter should be more attentive. It was the 60s. I have no idea what, like, subscription these days is like Netflix, Spotify. Like, you leave it in the inbox. I don't know. So, okay, I'll read it again. I'll try to discover it for the first time. Sorry, give me a few seconds. Hello, hello. Mic test. When I consider everything that grows, holds in perfection but a little moment, that this huge stage presenteth naught but shows, whereon the stars in secret influence comment, when I perceive that men as plants increase, cheered and checked even by the self-same sky, vaunt in their youthful sap as height decrease, and wear their brave state out of memory, then the conceit of this inconstant stay sets you most rich in youth before my sight, where wasteful time debateth with decay, to change your day of youth to sullied night, and all in war with time for love of you. As he takes from you, I engraft you new. It's beautiful to the ear, but it must be read 2 or 3 times to find the intelligence it transmits. Then you discover that Shakespeare was saying to a mistress or a patron, as time wears you down, I build you up. You may be getting older, as we all must, but I renew your beauty by writing to you. One can go on and on doing this. Follow Browning, if you can, quickly around the rose bush in Woman and Roses. I will make an Eve by the artist that began her, shaped her to his mind. Alas, in like manner, they circle their rose on my rose tree. Or try to paraphrase what goes on in John Donne's magnificent first stanza of Song, written some 250 years ago. Go and catch a falling star, get with child a mandrake root. Tell me where all past years are, or who cleft the devil's foot. Wow. Sorry. So, this isn't the contemporary poetry that was in the last grade. 20th century poetry does demand greater attention than much of the poetry preceding it. I guess it may have said that current poetry demands more attention, but then here, let's highlight these old poetry, I guess. By the way, John Donne's song, it has very weird writing because it was written in the 250 years ago, so there are extra letters. Star is spelled Starre. Devil is spelled Divel. So I guess this is accented. Should we try it? Go and catch a falling star. Get with child a mandrake root. Tell me where all past years are, or who cleft the devil's foot. I tried. Lines like Pope's swift on his sooty pinions flits the gnome, and in a vapor reached the dismal dome, may have had significance centuries ago, but one can't be sure what they mean now. Vapors are no longer a physical malady, but what you can get from Vicks to cure one. If Pound's wanderings through Oriental history and Eliot's troubling fascination with culture seem unfriendly, one only needs turn to John Milton and consider vexed Scylla bathing in the sea that parts Calabria from the hoarse Trinacrian shore, or accept a visitation of Shelley's relentless azure heavens, unpavilioned vistas, and fast influencings holding an unremitting interchange with the clear universe. The charged quality is as peculiar and necessary to poetry as walking on two legs is to man. No poet who has made easiness his attribute has ever committed to the permanent body of words and ideas we call literature. "I never meant my poetry," said Robert Browning, "to be a substitute for an after-dinner cigar." When the sidewalk critics of modern poetry cite the good old and often embarrassingly mawkish poetry of a few centuries ago as models of clarity and communication, one can only conclude that they have either faulty memories or, less charitably, that they have never read poetry at all. One is entitled to ask whether the detractors of modern poetry are rushing home of an evening to take in the glories of Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage or Tennyson's Idylls of the King, or whether, instead, the time isn't being spent with the idol of electronics. So I guess the point of this chapter, attention please, is about I guess it's about how, even though in the previous one where its metaphors are very straightforward and basic, this one is give it attention, perhaps even more attention than before. That even though in the very old poems they're very beautiful, but they're very old, and we can't even fully comprehend even the literal meanings of what they're saying. So it's a very different context, and these current critics who keep talking about the good old days may not be fully there, you know. They have a what you say, a very biased nostalgia, you know. Oh, we're almost done. Last two sections, and it's an hour and 15 minutes. Okay, let's do this. Is anyone listening? Let's admit that the most influential poets of the past 50 years have cared little about speaking into the public ear. But let's also admit that we cared not to listen. Our system of values, our media of communications, our lack of traditions in the arts, the emphasis our society places on the practical as opposed to the impractical, all have worked against the contemplative attractions of poetry. We have never read much poetry, and therefore we can't understand that poetry is not designed to replace the newspaper, but is intended to enhance our awareness of life. Poetry is unessential for man's survival. Poetry is unessential for man's survival. You cannot eat it, but poetry is essential for civilization's survival, for it represents all that is humanizing in mankind, because everything except thinking is easy in the 20th century. We expect poetry to be as simple as opening baked beans with an electric can opener. We operate on the misassumption that poetry doesn't require our highest intelligence and our best attention. But it does. Poetry is a way of feeling, thinking, and then knowing. And modern poetry has absorbed more ideas from more sources: Freud, Marx, Lincoln, Einstein, Whitehead, than any poetry in history. It was bound to. We have learned more about ourselves in the past 100 years than in civilization's previous several thousand years. Reading poetry has not been our style. We've been too busy with the gross practical matters which poetry escapes. But in Japan, poetry is part of the way of life. Businessmen are almost as likely as poets to write haiku. In France, statesmen and politicians write poetry as professionals. But in the United States, the businessman who reads poetry can generally stop conversation by simply saying so. The press marvels at the fact that William Carlos Williams has been a successful physician as well as a distinguished poet. And our journalists still haven't recovered from the discovery that the late Wallace Stevens, while writing some of the most refined poetry of his era, was also a vice president of a Hartford insurance company and an expert in claims on surety bonds. Carl Shapiro insists with vigor and appealing candor that one of the things wrong with modern poetry is that it is so scholarly it has to be taught in college. Excuse me. Carl Shapiro insists with vigor and appealing candor that one of the things wrong with modern poetry is that it is so scholarly it has to be taught in college. But would modern poetry have to be taught if it had been as blessed as the other arts by the advances of modern technology? FM radio and the long playing record have brought great music, free or at small cost, to all of us. High speed, high precision lithography, and silkscreen printing have made inexpensive reproduction of great paintings the symbol of popular culture. But how many of the multi-million circulation weekly magazines or Sunday supplements regularly publish poetry in their pages? Perhaps if our poetry were clear enough, it would find the big audiences. On the other hand, our most straightforward poets, Robert Frost, Carl Sandburg, Winfield Townley Scott, Mark Van Doren, Engel, Shapiro, can count on their fingers the times their poetry has appeared in the popular magazines. How can we acquire an understanding of modern poetry if we never see it where we do most of our reading? Obscurity cannot be the sole reason for the public's estrangement with poetry. Dylan Thomas was never an easy poet, yet his public readings were great successes. During the 1950s, Robert Frost's lectures and recitations drew audiences of thousands of persons, even though his poems demanded all the reverence he himself brought to them. In April 1956, some 13,700 persons came to hear T.S. Eliot speak in Minneapolis. So this section, I guess what they were trying to say with the previous chapters of this essay is how, yes, a contemporary poetry should demand attention. Again, because it is the product of a very, it's a cultural shift, you know? Like in the previous chapter where, the great changes with symbolism to French, like, modernism and all those movements. It was the age of industrialization. And I guess in the 1960s, even if the internet wasn't there, there was the leaps and bounds in technology of silkscreen printing and radio and the long playing record and high precision lithography. Things were easy to get to the masses. This concept of this common denominator of culture, of how easily accessible and convenient everything is. And this was pre-internet, So the poets of this day and age, very different from before, where poetry was celebrated, was part of everyday life. Now wasn't so, it wasn't a part of their lives. It wasn't so sought after. Or maybe on the flip side, it wasn't distributed, It doesn't sell. Poetry itself as an art form tries to escape this masses because it's art. Even though you can reproduce painting, it wasn't designed to be this easily consumable thing, this bite-sized convenient package. Poetry is very subjective. It's hyper personalized to each and every individual, us. And I guess these people have struggled, and hence why they made this book, to really bring it home, to be part of this FM radio, this lithography, and the publishing of this book. They were trying to be the ones to, here you go, here's poetry, so yeah. Last section. In days ahead. It is only wishfulness to think better days may be ahead. Long playing records by poets reading from their works may establish a public tradition for poetry, spoken as it must be. Prose writings by poets like John Ciardi and Paul Engel are turning up everywhere, in all sorts of magazines and books. Poet critics like Ciardi and Shapiro are making poetry interesting to read about, and the poet, not without risk, is becoming a public figure again. He must, in order to be heard amidst the shouts of the age. The paperback phenomenon is working to poetry's benefit. publishers at last are bringing out collections of new modern verse at prices which put poetry within almost everyone's economic reach. More and more poets are lecturing, worrying about their isolation, and writing with the clarity absent in the poetry which began the modern poetry revolution. Our poets our poets want to be read. I know of no poet who believes with Stanley Kunitz that American poetry is in its silver age because poetry is going unread and the poet can write to please himself. If the silver age is poetry without readers, the golden age would have to be poetry without poets. Poetry needs readers the way stars need the sky. For we give poetry its meaning. This, above all, is what the little girl on the May morning was saying. Poetry will be whatever we make of it. The music of our moods. The emotions we cannot locate in other language. The special sensibilities of our age. Because poetry comes from our depths, it is the way we say yes to life at the height of our humanity. This collection of poems is for readers rather than poets. It is for pleasure rather than scholarship. It covers as much of 2,000 years of poetry as possible within some 500 pages, and without forgetting that in the nature of things, we are most strongly drawn to English language poetry and the poetry of our own times. Many of these poems are old. You will remember reading them often, perhaps with pleasure, and probably with the chalk on your hands. But there is also plenty here to grow on. A good many of these poems have never appeared in an anthology before, and most of them have never together before. Of course, not every poem in this collection is for every reader. Such is impossible. But everyone who picks this book up should be able to find in it somewhere, and more than once, a voice that speaks to him as if it were his own, and as if it had never been heard in the world before. Webster Schott, Kansas City, Missouri, May to June 1960. Whew. So that was, oh wow, it's been an hour and 30 minutes. Okay. So that was a long diatribe. That was a lecture. Yeah, it was a journey. So I guess that last part was trying to really, in my last step back, like there was this talk of, the struggles of the poet of that age. It wasn't being distributed, and then it was. They're trying their best, and yeah, like I was right. They were, with this book and with many other endeavors, they were trying to give it to a new audience. And I guess with this series of podcasts, I think, yeah, it would be a disservice at this point to go with my original plan, like for this series of content, to read and then dissect, interpret with our 2019 um, insight, I guess, with our 2019 point of view of like a point of view of a 25-year-old, um, someone who graduated college, um, hasn't read poetry in years, like someone who thought himself a writer at one point long ago, who isn't writing so much anymore, who isn't reading so much anymore, you know. So this is like the first steps, baby steps. I guess this is a good book to start on, you know, like the roots of humanity, the something not important to humanity's survival, but something integral to civilization, you know. So yeah, thanks for staying up with me. Um, it's been, that last part was a struggle. You can click off this video because this next part is gonna be like a look back to what just happened in terms of like the self improvement aspect of this series. So I guess the reading through, I identified some like not problem, but some areas where sometimes I don't know why. I guess because I'm reading ahead, so appear I pronounce as afear. You know, some mispronunciations here and there that I just blaze through. I'm no longer very conscious about mispronouncing names, and it's well, that was a struggle because that was an essay of, you know, where to stop, where to step back and give my thoughts, and then go back in again, and then yeah, it was difficult trying to read things with many, like, with different tones, you know, like I was trying to, I don't know how it got off in the recording, but you know, it was really hard, especially with the first time. And again, this is the most I've spoken aloud in this week about how different tones are with, like, in a sentence. Okay, this sentence, title in quotations, and then line of poetry, and then oh, derisive quote from a critic that was wrong in hindsight. You know, those different tones. So I don't know how good I was. Um, I'll watch this back, but I don't know how good it was conveyed. Yeah, I tried. And then the reading of poems themselves, you know, some of those, especially some of those old poems, even the new poems, like, it's very easy to go with Edgar Allan Poe's The Bells, you know, The Raven, these easy lyrical poems. And then there are the very, woof, like the ones that are quite difficult to find, like, a flow. So yeah, we'll see what type of poems we have moving forward. I don't even know if they're arranged by alphabetical or by chronological order. I don't know, we'll see. So once again, thank you for sticking around. See you next time.